All right. You know, it's a pretty powerful opening to a breakfast. For me, I'm not having joined you before. It's pretty impressive to me, and there's a lot of energy. I hope I can live up to some of your expectations. I'm happy to share breakfast with you, and also to share a little about my life as a public servant and the impact of my faith on what I've done for 30 years as a Coast Guard helicopter pilot, and now in local government for the last 11 years. So to me, it's poignant that this is the first day of November, and we have Veterans Day coming up in 10 days. And you know, I for one am very grateful to all veterans who have given any amount of time, whether it was a single enlistment or an entire career, to supporting and defending our Constitution and our country. Now, God gave me many gifts, but public speaking isn't one of them. And I believe in the best advice for public speaking, the 3 B's. Does anybody know the 3 B's? Be brief, be interesting, be seated. So I'm quite happy. I do much better in a one-on-one exchange with people than I do talking to an intimidatingly large group of people. So if you have questions, I would invite them, and really, I'm happy to take questions at any time. And I have to say, I'm grateful to Don David for the invitation, not just because of the breakfast and meeting you all, but also because it made me look back from the perspective of a 64-year-old man. And looking back and taking stock is sometimes a very good exercise. So it's hard for me to believe, but I have been in Albany for 8.5 years now as the city manager. I consider myself very fortunate to be in Albany and leading a really great team of people in our city government. I might note that the 8.5 years I've spent there is twice as long as I've lived anywhere else in my adult life. I had a 30-year Coast Guard career, and in that 30 years, we moved 15 times. So I retired in 2014 from the service, and then I went to Bothell, Washington, where I was deputy city manager for 3 years. So, you know, 30-year military career, 5,100 flight hours in helicopters and a little bit in fixed wing, and 17 moves. I could talk at length about that, but we've only got so much time. So I want to tell you about my personal background, describe my Coast Guard career, and then I'm happy, again, to take any questions. But really, if you have them as we're speaking, just raise your hand. Let's see here. Can you go to the next slide? So important to my background is that my parents are both immigrants. My mom was a Hungarian refugee. She was born in Budapest. She lived through the Nazi occupation of Budapest during World War II. She was raised as a Catholic. She lived, as I said, through the occupation, but then also in 1956, they had a revolution, and she escaped the communist regime there and the Soviet repression of that revolution. Can you go to slide 3? These are just pictures of that revolution, which Mom had collected in Life magazines from the time, and they're quite disturbing at times. Okay, slide 4, the next slide. My father was a Swedish immigrant. He was raised as a Lutheran. In Sweden, they had the law of primogeniture. If you don't know what the law of primogeniture means, it's that the eldest son inherits everything. The second son will have his commission bought in the Army or the Navy. No Air Force at the time. He was born in 1905. And the third son could become a Lutheran pastor or go out in the world and seek his fortune. Guess which number son my father was? He was number 3. So he came to the U.S., came through Ellis Island, and then I'll spare you the long story, but my mom and dad met in Southern California, which I try not to acknowledge to Oregonians. I know it's not popular. But they, of all things, became Quakers. And so my siblings and I were raised in the Quaker denomination, which, as you can imagine, had an effect on me as well. Next slide. All right, another thing I hate to tell you is that I am a native of Los Angeles, and I did end up going to that small town school there, and I wanted to be a ship driver. But the good Lord had other plans for me. Things happened along the way. I went to officer candidate school after I had met this young lady, and I didn't want to go to sea anymore. Next slide. So my direction changed a little bit. I didn't want to go to sea, but I was sitting here in headquarters on the Potomac River in Washington, D.C., wondering what had I done. And I thought, well, how about aviation? So after officer candidate school and a brief tour at our headquarters, I went to naval flight training in Pensacola, Florida, where Navy, Marines, Coast Guard, and Allied forces go for flight training. Next slide. So I'll take a little bit of a detour here to tell you about the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard is the smallest of the 5, now 6 military services with the Space Force, only about 45,000 people. How did it get started? I mean, people, especially people who are not on the coast, know very little about the Coast Guard. Other Coast Guards in other countries are civilian organizations. Why is ours a military organization? Well, most of the world's navies perform functions that are similar to what our Coast Guard does. They're very, what I'll say, pedestrian functions, very basic law enforcement, maritime law enforcement, search and rescue, of course, regulating commercial vessel traffic, licensing seamen, all kinds of 11 statutory missions. The guy that you see on the slide there, both in the top of the statue and at the bottom, is Alexander Hamilton. He's known as the father of the Coast Guard. And if you go to the, there we go. In the Federalist Paper number 12, he had that quote there that a few armed vessels stationed at the entrance of each port would be useful sentinels of the law. So you may know that the income tax only came about in 1915, and prior to that, throughout the nation's history, we had been reliant upon tariffs and customs duties as revenue, as income. And the American colonists had been very good smugglers. When they won the Revolution, they didn't stop being very good smugglers. They continued to smuggle, and they continued to try to evade those tariffs. And the customs inspectors in ports were notoriously corrupt. So Alexander Hamilton, if you go to the next slide, created this fleet of 10 cutters, each built for about $1,000. And he advised that the officers of this cutter service be commissioned as officers of the Navy, because he thought this will not only induce men more readily to engage, but will attach them to their duty by a nicer sense of honor. So, to this day, the Coast Guard is a military force because of that. And whether you believe that military status or officer status or being a naval officer prevents corruption or not, which I rather have my doubts, but that's the reason it is what it is today. So if you go to the next slide. So over time, the Revenue Cutter Service merged and merged again, and then in 1915, it became known as the Coast Guard. Next slide. And I'll try to whip through these because otherwise we could take a long time. You know, the United States has 95,000 miles of shoreline. The territorial sea goes out to 12 miles. And then there's something called the Exclusive Economic Zone, which goes out to 200 miles. So that comes up to about 3.5 million square miles of EEZ, which all the resources that are available in that ocean bed, in the ocean above it, are a treasure for our country. And they're not just living marine resources like fish, but also the minerals that are in the seabed. The next slide. Much of what we consume in the country is brought here, imported. Much of what we make money on is exported. So our maritime transportation system is vital to the health of the country. Next slide. So the Coast Guard has what I have called a unique law enforcement authority, because you go back to that charge that Hamilton made to the Revenue Cutter Service, was to basically respect your fellow citizens because they do not suffer a heavy hand. So that advises restraint in law enforcement. So over 250 years, the Coast Guard has had very broad search authority. You know, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution is the right to avoid or to reasonable search and seizure. So the Coast Guard can be at sea and search a vessel really at any point, at any time, and that's because it's exercised that restraint, and that authority has been upheld over years, many years. Okay, next slide. Back to my personal trajectory. I graduated from flight school, got my wings on April 10th, 1987. There were 4 choices for assignment. They were Barbers Point, Hawaii, Traverse City, Michigan, Houston, Texas, and Los Angeles, California. Well, of the guys that graduated with me, none of them wanted to go to LA. So I said, I'll go. I'll go fly over my hometown. Went back to Los Angeles. It was a great place in Southern California to become a Coast Guard pilot. Challenging, but not to the extent that Alaska would have been challenging. A lot of good missions. I tell people that I'm old enough to have flown aircraft with ashtrays and pilots who used them while they flew. It was a lot of different experiences, including the birth of my son. Next slide. We transitioned to a different aircraft, the H-65, which you see here, which actually started off having ashtrays, but nobody used them. This is the aircraft that's probably the most common in the Coast Guard. You see it in television. It was on Baywatch, and in fact, in LA, when I was there, we spent a lot of time actually filming the Baywatch series and implemented our rescue swimmer program. And it was there. They had the America's Cup in 1988 in San Diego. And I tell you, nobody ever thinks of this, but that was the first time I saw how effective a crowd control tool rotor wash is. Okay, my daughter was born in LA. Then I went to my second assignment, next slide, which was an exchange position with 771 Royal Naval Air Squadron in Great Britain. There's nothing like serving in a foreign country to help you look back on your own country and your own service, look through the lens of a foreign military service at your own service. I had a chance to meet the Queen, and we took Prince Charles and Diana out to their summer house on the Scilly Islands. We flew them out there and met William and Harry as little kids. I offered to show them the cockpit of the aircraft, and I said no. They said, no, we've already done that. And so, anyway, this little article up here is I had a baby born in the helicopter as we were landing at the hospital pad. And then the crew and I got to go back 2 days later and visit with the mom and the baby. Okay, next slide. From there, I got an assignment in Port Angeles, Washington, and it was in Port Angeles as I got to fly over the San Juan Islands and the Puget Sound and the Strait of Juan de Fuca that I fell in love with the Northwest. I thought this is the prettiest place on earth, and I've got to come back at some point and explore on the surface, whether in a boat or on foot or by bicycle, whatever. I became an instructor pilot, and what you see in the picture here, I would tell people one of the hardest things I ever did was land a helicopter on a ship. You see it during the daytime here, but landing it on a ship at night is something else altogether. I said that until I became an instructor pilot, and then the hardest thing I ever did was teach somebody else how to land a helicopter on a ship at night. To remind me constantly of the perils of the job, the lifeboat that you see there is the 44363, which was a 44-foot motor lifeboat that went out February 12th, 1997 to save a couple on a sailboat, and ended up turning on the bar at Quileute River, and we lost 3 of the 4 crew members on that. And I ended up flying that night trying to locate them and assisting with the rescue of the 2 people on the sailboat. And that's the island that you see there is James Island, and that's where that happened. Okay, next slide. From Port Angeles, I had taken one class as an undergraduate, poli-sci, international relations major, that I thought was the most boring class ever. It was called public administration. Well, here I was in Port Angeles, and I saw a solicitation come out for people that want a graduate degree in public administration. So in a rare fit of forethought, I thought, hey, I should start preparing to support my family in retirement. I applied, got the program, and went to George Washington University, got my master's in public administration, but it was in international trade policy. Well, there's an idea that when they pay for your education, that you need to pay back. They need to get a return on that investment. So they sent me to our headquarters, which is that building on the right, and they put me in strategic planning and business planning, which I knew absolutely nothing about, and I had to learn pretty quickly. We developed the Coast Guard's first strategic plan while I was there, and what was called the agency capital plan, where we looked at all the capital assets and tried to plan to replace them. And I kept begging the detailer to send me back out to the field to fly again. So eventually he did. Next slide. I transferred to Air Station San Francisco, and during this assignment, 9/11 happened. So on September 10th, to fly under the Golden Gate Bridge was a big no-no. On September 12th, they were asking us to fly under the Golden Gate Bridge, and all of you remember what a time that was, and how life changed in so many ways. It was at that time that we brought night vision goggles into practice, and they were a game changer. But it was also at that time that I realized finally that I needed reading glasses. So nothing stays the same. I was selected for command. Next slide. And after 2 years in San Francisco, we moved to Savannah, Georgia, where I was the commander of the air station in Savannah. The G8 summit happened there. We pioneered the use of rotary wing air intercept, which means that you intercept small Cessna aircraft, private aircraft, who are flying into a restricted area and turn them away. So hopefully nothing bad happens. But the Secret Service and the Air Force take the presidential protection mission very seriously. And if a Cessna, I think you might remember that in the 90s, a Cessna crashed into the White House. That won't happen again. That won't happen again. Okay, in Savannah, I was selected for senior service school. Next slide. I went off to the Air War College in Montgomery, Alabama, at Maxwell Air Force Base. It was a class of 260 military officers. I was the only Coast Guard officer there. There were about 80 foreign officers, including Pavlo Levtarov, who was a Ukrainian Air Force officer. And he's retired now, but he's been recalled, and he is very actively engaged in Ukraine now. One of the best parts about that master's program was regional security studies. I asked to go to Northeast Europe, and we visited Moscow and Stockholm, Sweden in 2006. So you see a couple of pictures there on Red Square, which was surreal to walk on Red Square, and that's St. Basil's Cathedral. And it was also surreal to go into the Kremlin and talk to Russian army officers. Interestingly, we spoke to a chaplain, a Russian army chaplain, and back then in 2006, he was talking about discipline problems in the Russian army and morale problems. And what he described was horrific, and the sad thing to me is that it seems that nothing has changed. That was 20 years ago. They still have those problems. Next slide. Again, got a chance to go to St. Petersburg and visit That's a restaurant that's rumored to be owned by a friend of Putin's. The battleship Aurora is where the Russian Revolution started. And then that's St. Catherine's Palace there. Okay, out of the Air War College, I got assigned to Astoria, Oregon. And I was the commander of the group. There you go, that's a great slide. The commander of the group there, which now included an air station and 3 lifeboat stations. And so, if you're fortunate enough to be good in what you do and be successively promoted, you get promoted above where you're, above your specialty, right? So now it's no longer just flying, but it's also managing boat operations, which to me as a sailor was very rewarding. But Astoria is known as the graveyard of the Pacific. I think you all know. I had a chance to fly up and down the Columbia River and up and down the Oregon coast, and it cemented my desire to come back to the Northwest, which is why I'm here today. So next slide. This was what my office looked like from the cockpit of an aircraft flying over the Cascades. And also in Astoria, I realized that public administration wasn't all that bad, all that boring. I at this point was managing an airfield, a fire department, 160 housing units, a medical and dental clinic, and it was like managing a small city. And we worked very closely with the city of Astoria. So I started looking at retiring and going into public administration. Next slide. From Astoria, I went to New Orleans to be the chief of staff for the 8th Coast Guard District. This was when Deepwater Horizon exploded, and I had a chance to meet and develop a bit of a relationship with the families of the 11 men that were killed in that accident. The oil industry is huge along the Gulf Coast, so that really dominated our work down there. But there was a lot more to it, too. The whole brown water fleet, which is all the tugs and barges that work the Mississippi River and the Missouri River, drug enforcement, fisheries enforcement along the Mexico-U.S. Texas border. So a lot of variation. Next slide. Okay, I was selected to go to a fellowship at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. Spent a year there. The pictures you see there are a view from my apartment building, which was probably the best view I've ever had. And then a chance to meet a lot of really interesting people and hear them speak in that 1 year there. My studies were in Arctic policy and maritime piracy. And because of that, I was sent to the Pentagon after that. If you take one more slide, you'll see we took a trip to South America to show the fellows what it was like, what the counter-narcotics mission was like. So the picture you see here is a young Colombian national police officer, and the pictures on the left are a simulated drug lab, cocaine lab, in the jungles of Colombia, and they train their agents using that simulated lab. Next slide. Okay, I went to the Office of the Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon to serve as the Coast Guard's liaison, and that was my last assignment. I had hoped to make Admiral, but it wasn't to be. So few people know that when you reach the 30-year mark, if you, in any of our military services, if you haven't been selected for General or Admiral, you must retire. And so at that point, I really started taking it seriously and looking around for what I'd like to do. And I really had liked working with teams of people and getting stuff done at a local level. It would have been easy at that point to take off the uniform, put on a coat and tie, and go to work for Price Waterhouse Coopers or Booz Allen Hamilton or SAIC, but I wanted to get back and work on local issues. All right, so if you go to the next slide, that's the career. Now, the impact of my faith on my work, and I have spent 8.5 years in Albany. I'm happy to talk about city management, if anybody has any questions about that. But I thought that the Coast Guard was less well known, so I concentrated more on the Coast Guard. But in both worlds of work, it's really all about leadership. A lot of people talk about leadership, and leadership matters a lot. And that's kind of like motherhood and apple pie. I mean, you wouldn't disagree with that. And within the last 10 or 15 years, maybe longer, you've heard often the term servant leadership. And I really think that that's not a separate kind of leadership. I think leadership is rooted in servanthood. In both the Coast Guard, in the military, and city government, leadership is about service before self. And my faith tells me that true leadership is servant leadership. It's modeled after Christ's example. It means leading with humility, putting the needs of others first, and striving to uplift those around me, whether in uniform or in City Hall. Christian teachings emphasize compassion and justice. As a commander, holding the welfare of the crew in your hands, one often has to be able to play judge and jury. And compassion is important, but so is justice, so is accountability. How are they balanced? And you will be familiar with Solomon, the story of Solomon, how he famously asked God for wisdom to govern his people well. And that request itself reflected a desire to balance justice with empathy. And his wisdom allowed him to understand deeper motives of people, discern truth in complex situations, and apply justice in a way that considered both law and human dignity. Biblical teachings associated with Solomon also show his belief in compassionate leadership, especially toward the vulnerable. For a city manager, Solomon's Proverbs often emphasize mercy, kindness, and humility. So, which brings me to what I think are the three perhaps most important components of good leadership, and three things that my faith has helped me to understand or start understanding and appreciating: humility, courage, and attitude, a positive attitude. Humility is not often mentioned in leadership writings. You can read about ethics, strategic vision, communication, but think about the role of humility. Jack Welch, you remember him, General Electric, I think he was CEO, would say, when he asked about how the secret of his success was, that you've got to be willing to hire people who are better than you are, who are smarter than you are. If you're arrogant, you can't do that. You've got to be humble to do that. And it's just logical that there are people who are better than you are. You need to ask for help. I need help often. And if you're going to empower people, which is a key component of leadership, you have to be willing to acknowledge that there are people that do things better and do things differently. Humility allows us not to insist on our own way. There may be a better way. There are, like I said before, lots of references to servant leadership. Some people even try to define it, but how can you really serve, I would ask, without being humble? It also allows you to laugh at yourself, to not take things, especially yourself, too seriously. It allows you to give credit to other people while taking responsibility. It allows an attitude of service above self. And certainly in the aviation world, it's important to knowing your own limits. You can know the aircraft's limits very well: oil pressure limits, speed limits, RPM limits. But what are your limits in terms of the G's that you can take, the amount of hours you can fly? So, one of the things I struggled with as a Christian was the idea of confidence as a Christian pilot. You've got to be confident to be a pilot. Confidence is good. Arrogance is not. And I say I struggled because I thought about pride and how pride is a sin. Arrogance creates an inability to recognize or acknowledge your own mistakes and an insensitivity to the needs of others. when I was a commander for the first time, I had 3 Ps. They were proficiency, professionalism, and pride. Proficiency because I didn't want to have to go to the door of a wife or a son or daughter and tell them that I had lost their father or husband in an accident. So I wanted people to be as proficient as possible. Professionalism, I wanted them to be professional officers. Pride, because I wanted them to be confident and know that what they were doing was a good and noble mission. But I drew the distinction between pride and arrogance. But again, I struggled with how to put that forward. Okay, courage. You know, when the pandemic hit, there was a lot of, I would say, panic. And I would say to people, I said then and I would say it now, that panic never accomplished anything, and panic is contagious. So if you're in the cockpit of an aircraft, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, you're running low on fuel, and all of a sudden you see a warning light come up, and you've got a rescue swimmer down in the water. If you start talking like that and start talking really fast, that panic is going to infect the rest of the crew. So you've got to consciously lower your voice, slow down, and go through your trained procedures and handle it as well as you can. It requires courage. But it's courage, not just operationally, but courage professionally as well. Courage to stand up for your people, as well as humility to be able to give them the credit for good things. And I would often say that to do a good job in any job, you have to be willing to lose your job. Otherwise, you become paralyzed with fear. And again, that courage allows empowerment, which is necessary for a culture of innovation. And you have to actively, as a leader, breed that, encourage people. Courage is not the absence of fear. It was either Franklin Roosevelt or Nelson Mandela who said, courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the ability to overcome that fear. Ethical decision-making, integrity, they often require courage. The Coast Guard had core values. City managers have a code of ethics. Both have been very important in my life, but it's my faith that has provided my moral compass, the compass that has guided my decisions, especially in complex or high-pressure situations. Integrity and accountability aren't just professional standards, they're spiritual commitments for me. And many years ago, I committed to speak truth to power. I committed to do what was right, even when it wasn't easy or popular. In fact, remember that phrase? In order to do a good job, you have to be willing to lose your job. I had an admiral tell me once that when he made admiral, he realized that nobody would ever tell him the truth again. Well, that really makes the hair on my neck stand up, because if nobody will tell you the truth, how can you make a good decision? But it takes courage sometimes to tell the truth. Okay, lastly is attitude. Looking out for those that work for you, truly looking out for them, means that you have to, I feel, maintain an attitude that inspires courage and models humility. I suspect that many of you will know Chuck Swindoll, right? Pastor and theologian. So if you do, you probably know his short piece on attitude, which I'll read here, and I quote, "The longer I live, the more I realize the impact of attitude in my life. Attitude, to me, is more important than facts. It's more important than the past, than education, than money, than circumstances, than failures, than successes, than what other people think or say or do. It is more important than appearance, giftedness, or skill. It will make or break a company, a church, a home. The remarkable thing is that we have a choice every day regarding the attitude we'll embrace for that day. We cannot change our past. We cannot change the fact that people will act in a certain way. We cannot change the inevitable. The only thing we can do is play on the one string we have, and that is our attitude. I'm convinced that life is 10% what happens to me and 90% how I react to it. And so it is with you. We are in charge of our attitudes. I'm in charge of my attitude, and I've found that attitude is contagious. And it has long been my practice to try to foster an attitude or a culture of collaboration, mutual respect, teamwork, whether among Coast Guard personnel or city staff. I believe in the power of shared purpose and the importance of treating every person with respect. And this principle is woven throughout both our Old and New Testaments, emphasizing dignity, kindness, and love in our interactions. In fact, going way back in my life, one of the most meaningful scriptures to me was, I think it's 1 Corinthians, a part in 1 Corinthians, that love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres, and love never fails. So an attitude of gratitude, optimism, confidence is key to inspiring a team. And summing it up, leadership, although it's hard work, it's necessary and noble work. Resilience in the face of challenges comes in large part, for me, through prayer and faith. In both my military and my local government careers, there have been plenty of challenges, crises, criticism, especially plenty of criticism, and tough decisions. My faith is a source of strength and peace and of courage to face these challenges. Prayer helps me stay grounded, and many scriptures remind me that I'm never really alone in facing adversity. So these were thoughts that I offered for your contemplation. Leadership does involve lots of learning, lots of trial and error. And my life has been a lot of trial and error. I wish I could tell you that I'm a good Christian. I do serve as an elder in my church, but that doesn't make me necessarily a good Christian. I can tell you that my faith has led me. It's kind of one of the things left over from my Quaker upbringing is the idea that we should be open to the Spirit moving us. And life provides lots of opportunities for learning as long as we're open to them. So thank you for the opportunity to share with you this morning. And again, thank you for breakfast. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. All right?